Hello, listeners. Welcome to another fantasy animation podcast episode with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
So for this episode, I think this episode might be filed onto one of our more, not unusual, but we're going to take a different approach, I guess, maybe, in focusing on the character, the man / myth / mouse, the legend that is Mickey Mouse. So as I said, an unusual episode where we're not focusing necessarily on a particular film, TV program, fantasy animation example, though we will look at a few exemplar shorts chosen by our special guest who I'll introduce in a moment. Instead, we're looking at a star, I think, an animated, I wouldn't necessarily say the first animated star, but I will be happily proved wrong shortly. But I think, yeah, I cannot underestimate the impact of, but you know, Mickey Mouse is the sort of eminent Hollywood, certainly I would say, animated star of the 20th century. Even today, you know, we've got Mickey Mouse is the figure of perhaps American animation in the golden age, and obviously subsequently has a history both on and off screen, which we'll talk about, that maybe is something that we won't do full justice to in the hour and a bit that we've got. But hey, it's Mickey Mouse. We'll have a go. So, Alex, is a mouse with anthropomorphic features a fantasy?
Well, yes. So we can talk about that.
Yes.
And the various fantastical situations that he's put in, which we will also talk about, because we've got a range of shorts that our guest has sort of curated for us to have a look through, and you'll find them in the notes for this episode. So please do check them out yourself while you're watching along. But you know, if you don't want to do that right now, I think you'll be able to follow along with the discussion, because we're talking about one of the most iconic sort of, I would say, animated characters, but just sort of characters.
Star, or maybe not a character, maybe a star.
Sure.
Who knows?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Or someone knows.
And you know, I guess we'll say this in a minute, but you know, I was teaching literally this morning. I was teaching a module on transmedia narratives, and you know, I show a series of images on the screen, and everyone knows who Mickey Mouse is. You ask the question, "Have you seen a Mickey Mouse cartoon?" and suddenly, certainly for this generation, it becomes less and less obvious. So this is perhaps the quintessential example of a star transcending the text in which the stars are in. So,
yes.
It was nice to be put back in the texts when we watched these episodes and see how this star was born.
Yeah, well, exactly. And we have three shorts. Karnival Kid, Mickey Steps Out, and Clock Clean, as I said, which we'll put a link to, so you can watch along if you wish as we talk through them. We are going to be ably guided by an expert, I would say, in the sort of field of Hollywood animation, golden age Hollywood animation, and particularly animated stardom. So we are delighted to be joined on this episode by Dr. David McGowan, who is a lecturer in the Contextual and Theoretical Studies of Animation at the London College of Communication. He's published widely on subjects including animation and cinema history, stardom, home video cultures, and adaptation. And his first book, a must-read, I think, for people interested in sort of animation history in the US context, but also animated stardom, a book that will appear for sure on lots and lots of reading lists, myself included, is Animated Personalities, so cartoon characters and stardom in American Theatrical Shorts, which was published by the University of Texas Press in 2019. He was previously at the Savannah College of Art and Design, but is back in the UK. And we will tease perhaps some of the things that are happening this summer as we record it. But for now, thank you ever so much, David, for we finally got you on the podcast. So thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So we're going to try and do justice, as I said, and fail miserably, but we'll give it a go, to map Mickey Mouse across these shorts and think about character, think about star, think about his in quote marks animated personality, let's say. Where did this sort of fascination with animation and stardom or animated characters as stars come from?
Yeah, thank you. It was something I was hoping to bring today, actually. I was trying to find it in my parents' house. It exists somewhere. It was my correspondence at the age of about 9 to the letters page of the Tiny Toon Adventures comic
right.
period.
Excellent.
Where I wrote in and insulted the sort of Daffy Duck analogue in Tiny Toons called Plucky Duck, and had a sort of a war of words on the page
right.
with this fictional character. And I think that was something I was always quite interested in as a child. Like, even though I know these characters don't exist really, and obviously there is a tendency perhaps to sort of view concepts of animated stardom as something that's inherently childish, that sort of that belief system. But yeah, even as a child, I in being very interested in animation, I was that weirdo who studied the credits and looked at all the names of the producers and artists and everything. But also, was really sort of fascinated in the notion of these figures having a sort of discursive existence that Bugs Bunny or my apparent nemesis Plucky Duck, was had a kind of textual life, even if I wouldn't have framed that. I wasn't that precocious a child. But yeah, that was something really I explored in my undergraduate studies at the University of Warwick, and then when I got to do my PhD, that was really where I sort of took this idea that cartoon characters have been frequently discussed as stars for a long time, but it has always been done in a kind of colloquial way that it's sort of a shorthand for they appear in a bunch of films and we kind of we know them for being film stars or actors. But yeah, my book was perhaps the first major attempt. I'll at least try and
why not stick your flag in the sand? Yeah.
To try and align it with star studies theory.
Right.
We again, both of us, you and me, Chris, were very fortunate to have Professor Richard Dyer as an undergraduate tutor who kind of, I suppose, wrote the foundational text on film stardom. And there has been this tendency or there was this tendency to look at Dyer's work, which is talking predominantly about golden age live action figures, and just basically say it doesn't quite fit for animation. And really my argument is that I think in many ways it does. Dyer, in his work, has frequently argued that he's specifically talking about the conditions of golden age live action stardom, and that the sort of theory that he puts forward is mutable and adaptable to other other mediums, other approaches. And yet, just so often, film theory, as it's often want to do, tends to sort of say, well, this works for live action, and it doesn't apply to animation. It's
I'm interested on how that would, an animated star would map onto the on sort of my thoughts on sort of fantasy. Are these fantasy stars, or are these just like other stars? Because I'm listening to what you're saying, and I guess my old quote I use a lot of the podcast is that fantasy is extra fictional storytelling. So it uses a lot of the same techniques that all stories use, but it does so in a way that declares its fictionality rather than kind of tries to mask it or hide it. And I guess we can map that onto what you're talking about and what Dyer talks about. And Dyer is quite at pains to say that almost everything about the star is fictional, but it has this kind of underlying authenticity that makes us believe in the fiction because it feels like what we're actually doing is piercing inside these people's souls and understanding their psychology. And hey, that article that appeared in Vogue, it wasn't staged at all. It was because there's this tether of authenticity to cling on to, even if we're doing it in quite kind of desperate or almost hysterical ways. Whilst that isn't true of these animated stars. So I guess, does that mean that the effect is that it's the same and we're just being asked to disguise that, we're trying to take Mickey as authentic? Or is that lack of authenticity, does it offer opportunities for the animated star to do things that the real quote-unquote star can't do? If Marilyn Monroe can be larger than life, can Minnie Mouse be something, extra larger than life? And, I just wonder what your thoughts would be on that.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both, really.
Right,
There are definitely times where the evocation of the animated star has been a kind of, almost an indictment of the live action industry.
Yeah.
That there is the sort of the use of the cartoon star to deconstruct the kind of truth claims and untruths that surround live action Hollywood. That's often a really interesting thing that's kind of played with. On the other hand, there are many examples of fan magazine interviews, studio publicity, and so on that really, again, just really want to sort of create that same fantasy that we do with a Humphrey Bogart or a Betty Davis or something. In some cases, these cartoon characters, rather than kind of self-reflexively adopt these markers of stardom, it's often done quite earnestly, and although it's often very difficult to determine exactly how audiences responded to it as well. At least looking at the way sort of fan magazine discourse kind of processed a lot of this material. There does seem to be this, at least a fair amount of audiences, not just me as a child reading Tiny Toon Adventures, the comic, adults in the 1920s, 1930s and beyond who know Mickey Mouse is just a drawing, and yet the kind of the effective power or fantasy of his stardom is something that seemingly meant a lot to a lot of people. That he is more than. There is actually a quote from one of these articles, if I can quickly find it. Mickey, I won't do the voice.
I'm sorry, I don't remember agreeing to that.
You can pitch it up in the edit.
Cool.
But there was a supposed interview with Mickey Mouse in the Motion Picture Classic, one of the fan magazines at the time, where he says, "It's no earthly use for jackasses and prod-noses to yell at me, but you're only a drawing." And he he says, this is an example from a fan magazine interview, which is called My Love Life and Other Things, as told by Mickey Mouse to Cedric Belfrage. And he sort of raises that idea of can an animated character have a private life? Or he says, can an animated cartoon have intimate moments? And he says, naturally, why not an animated cartoon just as well as any of the human cartoons who call themselves stars in Hollywood nowadays? So there is... that sort of realization that, as I say, both kind of, I suppose, like pricking the balloon of the belief system of live action stardom, but actually in many cases these kind of extra-textual materials and the films themselves are much more interested in Mickey functioning as a star alongside Clark Gable or Charlie Chaplin.
Well, yes, and I'm reminded if you've been to Disney World or Disneyland
sort of belatedly and
never been.
I've found it quite depressing.
I went as a kid when you don't find it depressing, or maybe you do if you're that kind of kid. But I remember, maybe they don't do this anymore. They probably don't because it's old technology. But one of the games you used to play if you were going for a protracted vacation there was the autograph book, right? So you would go around with this autograph book and get this, if you bump into Chip and Dale, you get them to sign the autograph, and you collect that. And then it's probably a selfie book these days, isn't it? Or some sort of digital one.
There's a QR code on.
Yeah, exactly. It's probably something like that. But I can remember queuing up for Mickey Mouse's autograph and just feeling palpably excited to go in and meet Mickey Mouse and I think it's probably similar to going to see Father Christmas at Christmas, like in a shopping mall at Christmas, or all these kind of things where the registers of belief and credulity are all over the place, but the effective quality seems to be about the same as if you were queuing up to get the autograph of any kind of star. So that's definitely an example of exactly what you're saying, that it may be winking, nodding, playing with, subverting, but they're still queuing up to get the autograph, right? Yeah.
And I think that was sort of the key thing, that there was no desire here to burn the system down, essentially. That, but I sort of talk about in the book that I think what's kind of interesting about like Mickey Mouse or Bugs Bunny and sort of why I'm quite keen to sort of reconcile with Dyer rather than like pull it apart.
Yeah, sure.
Is that, that these characters existed. Their films came from their films were released from the very same studios as were, churning out Humphrey Bogarts and so on. The films were screened as part of the very same screenings. Like the Mickey Mouse cartoons we're going to talk about today would precede, live action features with some of the big human stars of the day. And it's, again, the very same like fan magazines and publications that were talking about the human stars of the period, chose to make space to consider the stardom of Mickey Mouse or Betty Boop or similar characters. So there is, a particular proximity to the sort of classical Hollywood system that these cartoon characters enjoy. And I think in many ways, they are further extensions of the way Hollywood creates its products. And stars being products in many ways.
But I'm interested because what the thing about Mickey Mouse is different, that you could also apply to all of his gang and the Looney Tunes and the Muppets, is that it makes no sense to talk about the character Woody is playing I guess the only way you could talk about that in Toy Story would be talk about the character that like Andy sees him as, and then that's kind of, we're getting back into the realm of textual interpretation. But it would be weird if they did a sort of spoof article of Woody talking about his kind of acting process in making Toy Story 2. Other than the kind of the outtakes and things like that, there's something reticent about that, and it might just be the fact that he's a half a foot high plastic toy in the context of that movie. Whilst Mickey Mouse is, for want of a better term, a person, isn't he? Like, he has a house, he has a domestic life. Like, you know, it makes sense to think. And then we have things like Fantasia, where he is playing a role, or Mickey's Christmas Carol, where Kermit the Frog plays Bob Cratchit in Muppet Christmas Carol.
Woody doesn't play Woody.
Woody doesn't play Woody. So there's the animated star. The animated star needs to play an animated character.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if, as these other stars, the Mickeys, the bugs of this world, that becomes more and more part of the text itself, right?
So they are moving between
Space
texts.
Jam. I can't even. But Space Jam, there's even a sense that like Bugs is like doing his, he does his shtick, and then they all go off at the end of the day to like, Elmer Fudd chases him around the golf course or whatever.
Yeah.
And then they all down tools and go to the bar and like have a beer together.
I've actually got a chapter coming out in a book Chris is co-editing, which is all about. There's the Space Jam DVD has an audio commentary with Bugs Bunny.
Right, exactly. Right, fine. So there needs to be a space for these to be stars that perform their roles as well.
Yeah.
Right? Which is
So actually, I'm wondering, this might lead perfectly into Mickey Mouse, because there is something around the sort of contingency. Because you're right, and going back to your comment about the letter that you sent in, and I wrote it down, the war of words that you got into with this animated star. I remember, this is going to sound, if people don't know me, this is going to sound ridiculous, but I was reading a copy of Men's Health because I must have found it on the floor or something, and it had an interview with Mr. Incredible about how he keeps in shape.
Right, yeah, interesting.
And I went through a similar kind of. So I thought I might be able to use that as a sort of like, but it seems like you're right. This doesn't happen as much as it did then, and there is something around. Obviously, your book is dealing with the studio era. It's dealing with this sort of theatrical animation in a particular sort of time period. But it seems like this was a really common strategy within this period, because animation at this point is 30, 40 years. It's still a new medium, and so it seems like Mickey Mouse and Alex's point that these are stars, or these are characters that are recurring, the new Mickey Mouse short, and so this seems something that was particularly rife in the 20s, 30s and 40s.
Yeah, and I think the sort of the big difference, it's something I'm actually writing at the moment, is I would make a distinction between the sort of Toy Story era is kind of kickstarting essentially if I want to align it to a sort of a movement in star studies. There's been an increasing amount of writing about franchise stardom, with this idea that kind of it's becoming increasingly desirable for studios to sort of collapse even live action stars into not, rather than back in the golden age where actors would be typecast, but they would be playing characters with different names in each installment. Increasingly, the biggest Hollywood stars are ones that are aligned with a particular sort of character across, within a cinematic universe. And so, I think sort of the difference, between like Woody and Buzz or Shrek or that kind of ilk and Mickey Mouse is that their stardom is almost entirely enclosed within, and I think that's what Wells is kind of gesturing towards, really, is that their stardom exists in a much more limited frame. There is a kind of narrative universe in which their stardom is kind of trapped, I suppose, in ways that Mickey Mouse or Popeye or something just didn't do. They appear in films that have certain generic qualities that run through them, but there is no expectation that they have to be. Woody always has to be Andy's toy until the narrative changes. And
yes, Andy can't be a chimney sweep in the next Toy Story. Woody can't just be like a different character. Which Mickey can though. Mickey can be can be working in one profession in one short, and then working in an entirely different profession in a different short. That makes sense?
Yeah, is that true of? And then we will talk about Mickey Mouse. But it seems like those. I don't know what to make of these sort of themed, sort of scared Shrekless and Toy Story of terror. It seems even with if they were made in the 30s and 40s, Mickey would be a vampire, or he'd be it would be like that. Whereas I think in all of those sort of themed ones, Shrek is still Shrek, because you say it's contained. His stardom is contained. Woody is always Woody. Woody's not. So it seems like there's a solidity to computer animated films and their stardom in a way that it's much more interesting to talk about this period where these stars are appearing in print and they're being interviewed and they're talking about their private life, and they are appearing. Steve Seibern says, this kind of theatrical animation is the ultimate in comedian comedy. It's centered on one figure. It's the Bugs. It's why you get the face of Bugs Bunny at the start of the cartoons, the face of Mickey. So it seems like it's a really rich era to start unpacking that reconciliation that you talked about with Dyer, that some of the Dyer's conclusions are a little bit spikier when applied to the animated cartoon, and it seems, as I said, that the sort of 20s, 30s, 40s is absolutely where we can really do some of this unpacking and thinking about what an animated star might kind of look and sound like and feel like and behave like. And so should we go through them then?
Yeah, well, I'll tick off the bit on my show rows that say briefly introduce Mickey Mouse. Done.
Sure.
But yes, I think that's an important. It just raises so many interesting questions. And yeah, we've got these 3 shorts that we'll go through. And I guess part of what this is we're tracing the kind of formulation and the kind of development of Mickey Mouse as a star, if we're going to claim that stuff. David, do you want to just start us by introducing us to the first one, and we'll kind of go through them each one and see what we can find in each one.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. The first one I chose, I basically didn't want to do Steamboat Willie.
Thank goodness.
Because it's,
Thank you for that.
It's been talked about to death, and I think everyone kind of knows it. I chose a relatively early instalment from Mickey Mouse. This is, I believe, the 9th instalment called The Karnival Kid, which launches Steamboat Willie, not the first Mickey Mouse cartoon, but the first to be released. Came out in 1928. This emerges kind of middle of 1929. It has a little bit of notoriety in that it's often viewed as the first film in which Mickey speaks to some degree. I mean, he makes some noises in earlier cartoons, but this is sort of the first one in which we hear him articulate a few sentences. But really, my reason for choosing this is I think if people look at a lot of the early Mickey shorts, and I think for a long time, Steamboat Willie has been like one of the only black and white cartoons that has been readily available from the Disney studio. As we start seeing these cartoons fall into the public domain, that might...
Yeah, I had a question about that, yeah.
That might shift, although, it's still the case, even though, that there are now a handful of Mickey Mouse cartoons in the public domain, all of those weird, like, slasher horror things are still focusing on Steamboat Willie as their point of, I guess you could make the Karnival Kid live action horror now that it's entered that. But Steamboat Willie just kind of is often seen as the essentially the kind of stand-in for Mickey Mouse in the kind of black and white period, in inverted commas. But basically Mickey in this early stage was a character that was made with a degree of desperation, without kind of going over all of the history of Disney before that time. He had a character called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Circumstances led to that character unexpectedly being pulled away from him. Disney didn't hold the rights that he thought he held, which I think, from that point on, he was very, very careful.
Quite hot on that, I'd imagine, for the next 80 years.
Basically, Disney, having spent a number of years trying to make a career in animation, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit was going reasonably well, and then he suddenly finds himself having to almost start again, really. Mickey Mouse is this character that, although he's often talked about as being this very kind of modern character, the application of sound to the Mickey cartoons really helped to essentially kind of kickstart what is often considered the golden age of animation. It often gets mythologized. Even Disney himself would often say it all started with a mouse. But actually, those early years of the Mickey cartoons, sound aside, and not to diminish its importance, are in many ways sort of aesthetically and narratively, and even in sort of Mickey's stardom, are looking back to silent conventions and sort of approaches to animation rather than Mickey being this kind of entirely forward-thinking figure. So yeah, I chose the Karnival Kid. It has that notoriety of Mickey saying hot dog and a few other things, but it hopefully is just a good example of a film that in many ways isn't that unique for that time period. The rubber hose animated style in the cartoon is something that Disney was essentially kind of mimicking other studios that had already successfully sort of popularized that style. And yeah, Mickey is in some ways quite an unoriginal character, really, and yet even early on there was something about him again that sort of indefinable aspect of stardom. Something about Mickey Mouse was standing out to audiences and feeling very different and very modern, even while the character kind of recycles a fair amount of stuff that you could find in cartoons from previous years.
So I'd be interested to hear in what ways it was standing out, and if there's what we've got to sort of show its standing outness. But it's interesting. If there is a thing of innovation, then is it the sound and because I take your point about the silent conventions and that it's stylistically very of that period, but obviously it's also a big kind of most of the stuff going on in this cartoon is rhythmical. It's based on the matching of sound to visuals. There's lots of dances. There's lots of performances like that. Even the hot dogs get in on the game, don't they? At one point. So it's not very narrative based, I would argue. Like it's a collection of quite small vignettes of set to music and song and sound effects. So is it that's captivating audiences, Mickey's ability to kind of be with sound, or is there something about the character that's nothing to do with that is starting to resonate with audiences even in 1929, a year after Steamboat Willie?
Yeah, I think a bit of both, really. It's actually notable, if you go back to the silent films, the Alice comedies that Disney made, and the Oswald cartoons. The authors Russell Merritt and J.B. Kaufman in the book Walt in Wonderland, they talk about how if you look at those silent films, the kind of the implication of sound was so frequently present in a lot of Disney's cartoons of the silent period. So many of those cartoons also involve implied musical performances, even though so much of that has to be kind of conveyed visually. So there is a kind of lineage that runs through. At the same time, it does really seem to be the case that sound really recontextualized a lot of stuff. That I was reading the book The Last Picture Show by William M. Drew, and it was really fascinating to sort of read how quickly silent conventions came to be seen as antiquated when sound came in. That although there were, it was quite a messy period. There were people that saw sound as a fad and wanted, the correct silent movie traditions to come back. Certainly, for much of the industry and for a lot of audiences as well, the presence of sound very quickly, even if it was sort of warming over existing conventions, seemed like an exciting new attribute. And it is sort of particularly notable with animated stardom that for various reasons, and not entirely due to sound, but relatively few of the silent animated stars made the transition to sound particularly effectively. So we do have this kind of like new era that Mickey seems to be spearheading, because your sort of Mutt and Jeffs, your
Jerry the Tyke. Sorry,
yes, and even Felix the Cat for various reasons kind of went from being you were saying earlier, like, is Mickey the first ever film star? I would say Felix the Cat and potentially several others are precedents, but Felix went from being kind of the top of the world just before the coming of sound to, as I say, for various reasons that include a failure to keep up with that new technology, quickly becoming sort of old news.
It's fun. Yes, I mean, yes, it's really interesting because you're right. Yeah, Felix the Cat. I've done some work on Jerry the Tyke and Felix the Cat. A lot of the stuff in the trade press, British trade press, and kind of publications that talk about Jerry the Tyke as a character, British character from a Welsh animator, Sid Griffiths, actually obviously always uses Felix the Cat. At that point in the 20s, it's Felix. This is the sort of benchmark. And it's funny you say that a lot of silent animated stars didn't make the transition to sound when people like Felix the Cat or stars that begin in print. They make the journey from comics to early animation, but they don't make the transition from silent to sound animation. So they sort of Mickey's our bridge. Felix is our bridge between sort of comic book and animated cartoon. Mickey's the bridge between this, or as you say, this new era. But it does make me think, 'cause you mentioned the kind of chaos, and both Alex and I have taught on a film history module, talking about kind of sound, the advent of sound, sound technology, sound on disc, the hybrid category of the silent sound film, and all that sort of chaotic period of trial and error that's a bit retrospective and a bit kind of teleological, but it sort of suggests that there were these experiments, as you said. But clearly animation it's not, because of its nature, it's not set up to be, it can be scored so directly to the sound, or it can be matched rhythmically to the sound, and it doesn't have to worry about a microphone underneath. All the trials and tribulations that are dramatized in Singing in the Rain are not tribulations that impact, or if they do impact animation, they impact them in a slightly different way. So it seems animation as a medium is set up really nicely, which is why you get your silly symphonies, to play with that to use animation as the interpretation of sound, to kind of visualize beats and have characters move on particular sort of beats and pulses. But it's interesting. I think I'm interested in the fact that you said there's nothing new as well, that a lot of this stuff, this cartoon is bringing together things that audiences would have been familiar to, like seeing that rubber host style or seeing certain kinds of anthropomorphic characters. So it's both sort of really new and then also a greatest hits of where Hollywood animation is up to this point.
Yeah, and I think hopefully, I think for Mickey, it kind of, I always think of the characters being just in the right place at the right time,
right?
Essentially,
right.
And as is so often the way with Stardom, really, that
discovered.
One of these fan magazine interviews, he talks about being an extra on the Felix the Cat film, and not feeling like his artistry was being recognised,
and also a heavy smoker, but we haven't got time to really talk about that.
And a heavy drinker. In fact, he talks about some bootleg alcohol during the Prohibition era.
Well, that's interesting, because actually, if there's nothing new, if you're an audience in 1928, as an audience in 2025, there's a lot new going on in this cartoon, because the Mickey that is here is not quite the Mickey that people might be expecting to see in many ways. Both in his design doesn't quite look exactly like the Mickey Mouse. Well, Mickey Mouse never looks exactly like the Mickey Mouse because he's always changing slightly, right? But his nose is more pronounced. He doesn't look as cutesy, but he also does not act as cutesy. So is this because there's this kind of subplot about him and Minnie. I don't know if she's named as Minnie I don't think she is. I can't remember.
No, I think she is on the board,
sort
of, because she's performing, isn't she, in silhouette at the start, in the sort of, because this is at the Karnival. Because I thought it was Mickey Mouse, and I thought this is a very different Mickey to the one I was expecting. So I think on a little sort of board, it sort of says "See Minnie." Okay. So I think she is named, but
she's named, but their relationship is much more, for a fact, more lustful than perhaps it appears in later versions of Mickey Mouse. So you just want to talk a little bit about that, because this is obviously not a character they've quite decided exactly what they're going to be like.
And this again is often seen as a bit of a hangover from Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, who was Disney's previous character. That he was a character that at times was a bit randy and
the Austin Powers is the word, apparently.
He was the Austin Powers of the silent era. Sure. Well, thank you for being the first person to ever say randy on the podcast.
Sexualized drinks, like I can't remember if but this is not the Mickey Mouse that you want your 8-year-old to queue up necessarily to get a autograph for in Disney World in the 90s. This is a Mickey Mouse that's a bit more
you go
sharp.
To the pub with.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And I sort of chose, because there are films like Plain Crazy, which is the first ever Mickey cartoon that was actually made, not released. But in that one, Mickey is actually even more kind of like aggressive towards Minnie Mouse.
Right.
She doesn't want to kind of kiss and cuddle, and he sort of pulls her. And,
right.
It's when I've shown that to classes, it rightly generates gasps of shock. Not even just because it's Mickey, but because of the act in general. But I suppose the fact that Mickey is doing this is a particular surprise. So yeah, he's not as badly behaved in the Karnival Kid, but I think that was the sort of issue of this period, that there just wasn't really that perceived need to sort of regulate the character's behaviour, that he, very much like the comedian comedies that Chris mentioned earlier, the kind of needs of that particular instalment took precedent over the star image that was being presented. You know, Mickey in one cartoon would be a sort of Rudolph Valentino type character.
Right.
Then in another cartoon, there's a film 1930 called The Chain Gang, where we start the cartoon with Mickey in jail for. I was amused that for undisclosed crimes, we don't get to discover what.
I think we've had a flavour of some of them.
Some fan fiction that might sort of give us some insight. But no, he is just seen as, well, he's actually a kind of rebellious prisoner, even in that context. Like we see this parade of these other animals that are just like beaten down and are sort of dragging these chains along, and then Mickey at the end is sitting on this metal ball and is just kind of like laughing and singing as all these other convicts are doing all the work for him. And basically that wasn't who Mickey was entirely, but there wasn't a sense of really what Mickey was and what he wasn't. The films, he's very rarely not the hero of the films, but there is also, I think there's more a desire in this early period to have his star image be, especially in the very early films, like they want him to be Douglas Fairbanks in one moment and then Charles Lindbergh in another. Like his stardom is almost rooted in his multiplicity as a character.
So is he like sort of like silent, almost like a silent, like a Buster Keaton or a Laurel and Hardy, or like these figures that have similar qualities and that they're often playing heroes but never quite doing it as well as the actual heroes. And like Laurel and Hardy can be.
Well, they're human cartoons, aren't
they can be or the cartoons or cartoon Laurel and Hardy's, one of the two. But like they can have that logic of, Laurel and Hardy can be in a completely different job. Very much like the Chuckle Brothers for all our UK
I'm glad you mentioned
listeners from a certain age. They'll be window cleaners in one episode, and then they'll be bricklayers in another episode, and then they'll run a hotel in the next episode, and that's all fine. Like that's all kind of part of the kind of transmorphic nature of these things.
But that vocational thing presumably is really important. That vocational that is part that doesn't undercut their stardom. That contributes to it.
Tom Cruise can be a spy in Mission Impossible and also a bank clerk in no film. But
I suppose I was trying to disaggregate some of these. We've talked about star. There's star, celebrity, actor, character. The role.
It gets very complicated.
It does get very complicated, but I think it's one of those. It's also one of those things that the animated characters or animation as a medium does not prevent us from having these interesting conversations around the way that as you fast forward a few years to the Looney Tunes or Bugs Bunny, but I'm thinking the sort of where they are deliberately playing in this role. They are playing a different character, El Bugza or something like that. There's a really interesting. They're the same but different, and they're playing roles. And so it is important that animation doesn't prevent us from having these kind of conversations. There is this sort of interesting negotiation with stardom that is then exacerbated by some of the stuff that you brought in, where these confessions of Mickey Mouse or these admissions where he sits back and has a cigarette and talks about his career. These are the audience knows this isn't. They're never not aware that these aren't there to convince us. The bloopers at the end of Toy Story are not really thinking that, maybe this is how... We know that they're not made. They're deconstructing an identity they don't have, but it doesn't matter. So this is these interviews that we've got from Mickey Mouse. These are not... They're pure fantasy. They're supposed... But we don't... Fantasy exists, so we embrace them, and we think, wouldn't it be fun? This is what it would be like, I think, if these were doing...
But I suppose a fantasy that it is potentially fun and pleasurable.
Absolutely. To imagine that these would be like that off screen, and what. But it seems like that the character on screen, Mickey Mouse, because you said begins his life. The character's life begins with a very different. And Alex, you said that the character hasn't sort of settled down yet. So the fact that the character goes through some changes really contributes to that kind of flexibility that you mentioned, that mutability that the character is able to, because he was slightly imperfect and changed his personality. That feels like the sort of trajectory that human stars go on.
Yeah,
and that's really.
Most stars of that period, the studios would kind of test them out in a number of genres and roles, and kind of work out where they were best suited. If they were to blossom into stars, it often involved a period of trial and error, and then a sort of crystallization, to the point where those early films become a source of fascination. We've had like TV shows and even books and things like before they were famous, and we get to see the sort of the working out of a persona that if it hits and it becomes established, like Mickey Mouse, it's very hard for us to look back on these old films and not look at it through the lens of what Mickey has become.
Well, should we move on to our next cartoon then, which is Mickey Steps Out, 1931? David, you want to just tell us a little bit about this one and why you picked it?
Yeah, so Mickey, although he, I've just said that he doesn't behave entirely perfectly in these early films. He's probably not the worst of the era. There was a sort of rambunctiousness. I suppose one of the things I was going to mention about the Karnival Kid is that a lot of these early films are rooted in kind of countryside, or in this case, like working class urban settings. There is a tendency in the early Mickey films for him to essentially reflect what had been the main audience for silent animation, although characters like Felix sort of transcended that a little bit. A lot of early cartoons were particularly consumed by kind of working class audiences and often had that sort of rambunctious spirit. Mickey, by becoming this phenomenon, started to attract middle class audiences. Disney's distribution deals for these films quickly saw them in more kind of coveted movie palaces and things like that. The film started playing in more rarefied circles, and basically Mickey started attracting controversy. As I say, even though his films weren't necessarily the worst, Mickey was perhaps the most visible figure, and I think again that's a sort of reflection of his stardom, that when Mickey did something wrong, even if it was something that was just like there was the film might have been like censored or banned in a very like local place in the United States, Mickey's celebrity meant that became national and sometimes international news in ways that other characters just didn't have that kind of discursive function for the journalists of that time. Although we sort of talk about the early 30s as the so-called pre-code period, which is...
Hi everyone, it's Alex here, just interrupting the podcast for a moment. Apologies, we'll get back to the scintillating conversation in just a second. I'm interrupting it with just a little bit of admin and a little bit of a plea to listeners, because we need your help, frankly. We have been running the podcast now for quite a few years. We're very happy running the podcast. We are thrilled by the amount of listeners we get. Always have been, always will be, and it's always growing, and it's always a really wonderful community out there. So thank you so much for listening. But the podcast doesn't do itself on its own. It requires Chris and I's time, and it also requires a bit of cash injected into it. I'm not asking for donations in this little plug here, but I am asking for your help to make sure we keep the podcast going on a financially sustainable and sort of time sustainable place. For example, right, there are hosting fees to pay. Okay, that's a couple of £100 each year. There's things like tech and cables. You might have heard a few episodes where Chris and I sound a bit echoey. That's because one of our cables broke and we had to find a way of replacing it and paying for it. And frankly, one of the things we're trying not to do is use our own money or our own pocket, our own wages, frankly, as full-time academics to pay for this stuff. We'd rather try and find alternative ways of funding it. Now, we have done that in the past and we'll continue to do that. We have no plans to introduce membership fees. We have no plans to start trying to sell you guys merch or asking you to go onto Patreon pages or anything like that. We want to keep this a free, easily accessible, educational resource which we're proud to produce, and we're really pleased that we are producing. So all we need from you is just a little bit of more help in terms of helping us to showcase the value of this podcast to some of the people that might pay for it. Okay, so the way you can do this is like a couple of different ways. One, subscribe. Okay, if you're not already subscribed to the podcast on whatever platform you're downloading this from, please subscribe now. Those figures really help us. Second, review the podcast on any kind of platform, okay? A star review is helpful. Written reviews are even better, okay? If you haven't done one of them and you listen to our show and you think it's valuable, please take 3 seconds out of your day. Just write a couple of sentences about what the podcast does for you, why you like it, and share that on the platform. That really, really helps. Third, share it with your friends. Share it on social media when you see a new episode being launched, okay? It helps increase the visibility. Hopefully more people can get it and access it too. That's really, really helpful. Finally, and this is a good one, this would actually be really, really helpful, is email us if you use the podcast in any kind of setting, okay? Whether you're an individual that just finds it useful, tell us why it's useful, particularly on an educational level. What have you learned from the podcast? What do you find that's valuable? What value has it brought to your life? Or what impact has it made on your life? I know that kind of sounds very lofty, but if you can just put the kind of simple, real-world changes that you've made, some things that how's it helped you approach the study of fantasy animation differently, anything like that, you can email us. That would let us know. If you're an educator and you use this podcast either to teach students or as part of your own research or as a way of inspiring further thought, let us know exactly how, some of the specifics. Maybe there's a course you have it subscribed to. Let us know. We know of some of you out there. We've worked with you in the past, but if you whether we've worked with you or not, please drop us that email. Really, really helpful. And you can do that at fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com. Basically, we can fund this podcast through various ways through our own network, but what we need from you is evidence that the podcast is doing something out there in the world. It could be doing something small and sort of not very tangible, like helping you to enjoy fantasy and animation movies. Great, tell us how. That's really, really useful, but we need the evidence for it. Or it could be, helping teachers, helping practitioners. Are you a company out there that set it on your training session? Anything like that. We know of you people out there. We find you in various different ways, but it'd be really helpful if you could come to us so that we can gather that data as we approach another round of kind of scrape together some cash to keep the lights on. Okay, it's not much. Yeah, it only costs us I don't know, 400 or 500 quid a year to keep this thing going. We think we give a lot of time to the podcast. Hopefully you'll think that's a reasonable exchange. We give that time often outside our full-time jobs. We're just looking to kind of find ways of boosting our case to get the funding out there elsewhere. So no Patreons, no merch, I'm afraid. But if you could help us in those ways, share, subscribe, review, or email us with your stories, that would be very helpful. The email address again is fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com. Let's get back to the show.
There was often this tendency to kind of characterize a lot of films from this period as being very rebellious and kind of like full of sexuality and even like violence and things.
We're back to Randy again.
Yep.
Yeah.
Disney very quickly kind of responded to cleaning up or kind of containing Mickey Mouse. So what is kind of notable about Mickey Steps Out then is it's not really the first, but I think it's a good culmination really of the efforts to contain Mickey Mouse in ways that would be more acceptable for this middle class audience. You've hopefully seen in the film that Mickey, he's not selling hot dogs in some seedy carnival anymore. He's living in a nice suburban location. He's seemingly got a mortgage and a bungalow, and he's
settled.
Yes,
in the broadest sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
And even his like romantic relationship with Minnie is a lot more kind of conventionally romantic, in sort of heavy inverted commas.
Yes. The first image of him is sort of him kissing her mirror rather than him doing anything else we've discussed so far, right?
Yes.
There's a much more kind of, I don't know, yes.
He
a
has
very different register going on.
He has an almost obsessive number of portraits of her in his bathroom.
Yes, I mean, it's as creepy, I would say, but in a different way. Yeah.
But it's designed to be read as, his kind of gentlemanly devotion.
Absolutely.
And his pure love for Minnie, whereas some of the early films were a bit more earthy in their.
So is this when we start to see an introduction of more secondary characters? So this is Pluto makes an appearance in this.
Yeah.
I don't suppose this is his first appearance, but Obviously, he wasn't in the first one, so at some point we've got a dog. We've gone and got a dog.
Yes.
Our friends starting to appear. Obviously, the next one we're going to go into that in a bit more detail. But is there a sense of a world around Mickey starting to be codified a little bit more, or formulated a little bit more by this point?
Yeah, and I think that's why I find Mickey's star image so fascinating, because it endures for so long, and yet as a productive characterization, he falters quite early on. That Disney sort of talked about the sort of limitations that were placed on Mickey, that he was increasingly getting letters from, I was going to say concerned parents, but it was adults as well. This was a character that was very much consumed by audiences of all ages and sort of thought about seriously by them. He just increasingly found that sort of Mickey, in sort of wanting him to be the hero, there was a limitation of what he could do. There was a scholar, Sean Griffin, who talks about Pluto as being one of those first attempts really to introduce a new character that could sidestep some of the issues with Mickey. He talks about like Pluto being a much less anthropomorphized animal. He's still obviously a cartoon character, but he is a dog. He's unlike Mickey, is this sort of bizarre human mouse hybrid. Pluto is much more just a dog as we understand it, and so the idea was that Pluto could kind of do things sort of innocently, in a sense, that Mickey Mouse, because we look at him as we essentially consume him as a human. If Mickey does things, we judge him by human standards. Pluto was an initial attempt to kind of sidestep that by having Pluto be the kind of innocent source of havoc throughout much of those cartoons. Mickey, as you saw, kind of turns into this kind of slightly bland boyfriend figure who, when he is at all aggressive or kind of active, it is usually now to quash chaos rather than him being the kind of instigator of chaos as he was in some of the earlier cartoons.
But I wonder whether that's also, a lot of my notes for the first one are around this sort of, as you say, this rubber hose, plasmatic musicality, nose stretches, Mickey's tail gets pulled and that kind of sorts it out, the nose gets cranked back into position. Even the animated intertitle at one point melts away. This is you don't get much, it's not the same kind of physicality. You get a different kind of physicality towards the end, and we'll talk about the sort of, I put very reminiscent of sort of Tom and Jerry in terms of the chase, and then we'll talk about the blackface as well. But I'm interested in that kind of grounding of him and this idea that you said, this effort to contain Mickey. I noticed that one of the things that you've provided, this Confessions of Mickey Mouse that talks about, there's a bit in the interview, this is February 1932, so the year after Mickey steps out. I suppose you want to know all about my love life. I'm engaged to Minnie Mouse right now, and it looks like the real thing this time. She's a field mouse. He leaned closer. It isn't generally known, but I've been married 5 times already. 4 of them divorced me, and 1 was nabbed by a cat. Minnie doesn't want to get married just yet, thinks it would interfere with her career, but just you watch me bring her around. There's lots of stuff we could say about that, but I think there is this. I'm wondering whether that containing kind of curtails this. I suppose what I'm saying is that journey that Disney animation goes on from plasmaticness to hyper-real we tend to think of it as happening quite later on, and we'll talk about the third example. But it seems like already within a 2-year period, 1929 and 1939, a lot has changed, and it's a totally different. There's like almost an intermediate stage between this early chaos of these plasmatic silly symphony cartoons and then this hyper-real world of Snow White and Bambi. And the break, as we know, between these phases is never clean. But it seems like looking at Mickey gives us an indication as to there is this interesting middle ground where he's at home shaving, he's getting ready for a date. There's this rudimentary plot around romance. There's a few sort of anarchic moments. But it's a much more constrained, less flexible, less. I don't know.
It hurts more as well.
Yeah,
there's lots of bangs and clangs in this second one. In the first one, it sort of feels like the characters can shake it off more.
Yes, agree.
There's less grounding in the physical world.
So that it's interesting that over a 2-year period, there's a lot has changed, and perhaps that's interesting to talk about. That there is that change, that containment of this character.
Yeah, And these fan magazine interviews would be curtailed shortly thereafter, and Disney increasingly would, again, sort of playing up the star concept, and would increasingly say that Mickey and Minnie are married in real life, but sometimes the roles require them to sort of do different things from film to film.
But is it because the rise of these things, these fan magazines, did that then have an impact on the fact that the cartoons could be less, like the drama didn't need to happen on screen because it was happening in the pages of these documents? So what you get on screen is that containment happens because something else is happening in print or with these interviews. There's a lot of legwork that they're sort of doing.
I think almost the opposite. I think some of these other texts took a while to catch up in a way that these interviews kind of perhaps persisted even after the films themselves were, for at least a little while, trying to place limitations on Mickey. Disney even found like Mickey was so successful, another sort of instance where, even if I say that Mickey has so many derivative elements, there were very quickly other cartoon studios that were making obvious Mickey rip-offs, even if in some ways they are kind of quoting a quotation in a sense. But some of these other studios would still make these kind of Mickey derivatives where Mickey's behaviour was rooted more in the older cartoons. And I think in some ways that was Disney's bigger reason for kind of... He eventually sues one of the studios, Van Buren, for... sort of infringement of his films. And certainly the way it was sort of presented in the press was it was less about kind of ripping off Mickey Mouse, but actually even Mickey himself is kind of quoted in one of these articles saying that these other people are making him and his friends do things they would never do, and there's already this attempt to kind of almost pretend that some of the earlier Mickey cartoons didn't happen. They're really kind of, as you say, that the world feels less playful in a sense. One of my reasons for choosing this particular film, I like to show it to classes, just these moments of animation of Mickey. I don't know if you sort of recall it, but those at home, if they have access to the film, they might be able to see this. In the bathroom where he's kissing Minnie's portrait, there's a bit where he kind of has the soap slip out of his hands, and he kind of slips a little bit, and it falls on the floor. And then he kind of turns to the camera and sort of like bashfully curtsies at the audience, like he's almost like apologizing for this, even just this like brief disruption of this moment where the middle class utopia has been shattered because Mickey the soap slipped out of his hand.
Right. Okay.
And there's a bit where he's walking along to Minnie's house, and he kind of trips over a rock, and they actually play this animation twice, and sort of briefly Mickey turns his head and looks at the rock with anger, and then he immediately turns at the camera and like plasters this big smile on his face. And I always wonder whether this was a sort of like slightly self-reflexive thing from some of the artists, but it makes Mickey look, I don't know, it's deeply troubled really, that he sort of he has this moment of anger but immediately has to perform, look at us and then he falls in the mud, and then he kind of looks at the camera again and sort of puts his hand to his mouth and like smiles like a little child, basically. And that does seem to be, even though kind of in some ways Mickey becomes more like adult. He moves to the suburbs, and he seems to be the property owner of his place. In other ways, the character is kind of infantilized compared to the slightly more rebellious hot dog vendor of Karnival Kid.
And I guess there's a sense there that he's performing to the camera more in those moments that you're highlighting, which I sort of do remember them, but they didn't strike me quite as amazing like as you're now describing. But yes, like there's a sense that he knows what he really wants to do is react in one way, but knows he needs to. He's on camera, so needs to that's another space being created for us to kind of fill the imagination of what Mickey's like off camera. And
it doesn't really happen that much with Mickey, because as Chris was saying, like we increasingly see this kind of more Disney realist world where it's kind of shutting down that awareness of the artificiality of the filmmaking process and everything. I always find that film as like an interesting stepping stone. Well, literally stepping stone. That's where he falls in and does his silly face. But a sort of stepping stone in Mickey kind of losing any sense of that. It almost feels like that final moment where he's, I'm over psychoanalyzing this, but like that final moment where he kind of interiorizes it. He has to. What's the word I'm looking for? Really, he all of that has to be just pushed down below, and
Sure.
you have to turn to the camera and smile.
And also, he's becoming, as you said, like earlier, he's becoming a kind of force of order. He's the stabilizing force.
Yeah.
He's the one that knows how to behave, and even if he doesn't naturally want to behave like that, he knows how to be in polite society and how you're supposed to be in front of the camera. And it's his dog that's now causing the disruption, and that's a really and that's a kind of, if you think about other kind of cartoon staples, there's Bugs Bunny is a bit more anarchic, but is a far less anarchic figure than his friends around him. If there's a stabilizing force, Kermit the Frog is another very very like trying to just keep this ramshackled group together, and it is the least kind of interesting but the most important in a way, because like without that figure, the chaos becomes unmitigated, doesn't it? So that's really interesting.
And I think that is the weird the weird sort of contradiction of his stardom, that he increasingly becomes an icon, and less a sort of viable, certainly protagonist. He's present in these cartoons, but I suppose increasingly he's either sort of inadvertently caught up in the chaos, or he's kind of there to fulfill that obligation. Only then for the seemingly more interesting stuff to to kind of happen.
Yes, that's an interesting thing. Yes, and the more iconic it becomes, the less he can do.
Yeah.
Because if to do stuff would be to risk alienating certain, if you can be everything for everyone, that works as an icon, but doesn't work as someone that does anything in the world.
Feels like there's a real, if this is coming, I'm just thinking about the kind of institutional. It seems like Mickey is now in a system, in a production system. I know he's always been, because that's how cartoons work, but there feels he's being institutionalized in that in that sense, grounded, as you say, contained. He's now part of a system that will keep him captive for the next X amount of years. We can move on to the third one. I mean, we can talk about the blackface at the end. We should talk about the blackface at the end of this episode, or the end of this short. It's very, very brief. I was reading a bit about it. I don't really want to sort of dwell too much on it, other than to say it aligns with Nick Salmon's point that of all the sort of great injustices that animation has given us, racism is one of the biggest kind of shocks. So there is a moment where the characters are sort of it's very Tom and Jerry in terms of this sort of domestic chase sequence around the kind of home, and it ends with this moment of blackface where they sort of get covered in soot and they lean up and they exclaim Mickey, Minnie, Mammy, Whoopee, and then the kind of cartoon ends. Sure. So yes, a moment of, but so I sort of want to do justice to it, but also we should do justice to that in another, talk about that element of classical Hollywood in another episode where we can do it, devote much more space to it. But it was an interesting kind of coda, because it seemed to, when you were talking about making this for kind of family audiences or something, Mickey it just seemed an interesting.
Well, yeah, except that I don't suppose the family audiences they had in mind would have batted an eyelid.
Nope.
In the sense that this is very in keeping with Eddie Cantor and all the kind of the slapstick comedians that Mickey is owning.
Yeah. Well, I think that is the sort of the awful legacy of the production code as well, is that it was a real intervention into it was one of the first times where Hollywood was having to think about sort of choices they made, and films were being talked about in terms of the production code was an attempt to sort of reinforce a sense of morality onto filmmaking, to make films. I forget even the production code has this sort of statement, something like this film should not lower the morals of anyone who sees it, and it speaks to, again, just how sort of limited the worldview of that supposed cleaning up of filmic tropes were.
Sure.
That this was a time where, especially in live action film, but it filters down to animation, sexuality was targeted much more forcefully than violence, and that's why we kind of shift from like the star image of Betty Boop, for instance, diminishes just around the time that the Fleischers who made Betty Boop also kind of now have this success story with Popeye, who in many ways kind of shifts the rubber hose jokes about sexuality to rubber hose jokes about punching people in the face.
But it sort of leaves then race as a remainder, just leaves race to sort of...
There's things in the code that are, the threat... I'm obviously using quotation marks, but there's discussions in the code of this kind of threat of miscegenation, and so it's actually to again, quotation marks, to improve the moral standards of these films by our standards, contemporary standards. They've actually codified and calcified something that's abhorrent, within that code.
So it's sort of an era where these films were supposedly passed as being acceptable, and yet we look at them now, and there were all sorts of tropes that remain.
Yeah.
So
last but not least,
move on to Clock Cleaners. So this is 1937, so much later now, and I think this would be the one that if anyone watched would feel, oh right, Mickey cartoon. This is what people are kind of picturing. Although obviously it's Mickey and Friends actually. So tell us about Clock Cleaners. Yeah,
so I think this is probably, of like all the three I've chosen, I suppose this is the most, as you say, canonical example. It's one of those ones that will turn up on Disney Plus. Disney are still fairly selective about the early Mickeys that they kind of include on the service. But Clock Cleaners kind of, I suppose, embodies the kind of modern Mickey Mouse. It has the benefit of, from 1935 onwards, Mickey shifted to Technicolor, and obviously that again helps with the sense of modernising the mouse, at least for contemporary audiences. But it sort of reflects that issue with Mickey, that if you watch these films, it was always present, this sort of uncertainty about his star image and his kind of agency, but I think it kind of exacerbates as we get into that more classical period, that they just don't really know what to do with Mickey Mouse. And so Pluto was a sort of stopgap solution. They start sort of pairing Mickey with Donald, and then they eventually sort of hit on what for a couple of years becomes perhaps their most productive formula for the Mickey series, which is Mickey, Donald and Goofy in some sort of adventure together, usually involving them splitting up, where Mickey appears at the beginning, he does a little bit of stuff in the cartoon, and then often we kind of move on, and the sense again seems to be that we are more entertained by the antics of, or certainly that there seemed to be a greater flexibility for what Goofy and Donald could do relative to Mickey Mouse, who end up kind of carrying the film, and then Mickey is often kind of collapsed back into the chaos by the end, as we see in Clock Cleaners. But he's kind of absent for a decent amount of one of the most celebrated films that ostensibly stars him, and that was kind of the issue with his, as we were saying earlier, his he was a sort of celebrity, but was less of a kind of viable film actor at this stage.
So that's what. So why is, because Donald Duck is the star of the show in this short, or at least in my opinion, and he is far more entertaining than Mickey, and oddly far more. I was more entertained by Donald Duck in 1937 than I was in Mickey Mouse in 1929. Despite that, if I really think about, other than some of the stuff we've touched upon, they're not doing that dissimilar roles, really. They're ones, but Donald Duck's unreasonableness is more endearingly unreasonable, because that's the character of Donald Duck. So what can we unpack this? What is it about? So Donald Duck is more entertaining but less famous, or less iconic than Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse is more iconic but less interesting.
In a sense,
and how does that work?
I kind of talk about it in the book actually. That I think it sort of reflects that star, the star status of different figures. That different celebrities we kind of treat differently in some ways. Like there are different stars that come with different kind of expectations and different iconography, and when certain figures transgress, we might be more shocked. We might be, that there are certain stars whose whole thing is that they are that they are badly behaved, and they seem to kind of that adds to their currency versus a more innocent figure for whom that could be a sort of career-ending attribute. In the book I kind of talk about it's sort of ironic, really, that Betty Boop in some ways is the character of the era who seems more akin to Mae West, who was one of the kind of cause célèbre for the production code administration, that her films were singled out as being rooted in this kind of sexuality and supposed bad behaviour. And yet Mickey, again, it just seemed to be that he performed that iconographic role, that his celebrity focused attention on him in a way that Betty Boop managed to avoid, at least until film guidelines kind of forced a change. I think the difference with Donald is that, with the exception maybe of his very first appearance, like pretty much as he was introduced in the Mickey Mouse cartoons, he was set up as this bad-tempered character for whom there was comedic pleasure taken in seeing him being almost like tortured and kind of getting angry, and there was a sense that audiences kind of enjoyed Donald's frustration and punishment and anger in ways that audiences seemingly just didn't like to see Mickey getting that frustrated, and didn't seem to like Mickey getting so heavily punished in response. There was I think it was an interview in the New York Times that this issue was raised about why did Mickey have to become so well behaved, and why did Donald get away with it? And it was an unnamed Disney animator, but they said with Donald, I think the quote is, everyone knew he was bad and didn't give a damn. His star image was set up in such a way that it kind of thrived on that kind of imagery, whereas for Mickey, increasingly he was again, it's a kind of negotiation between audiences and the filmmakers, but he was increasingly positioned in such a place where his star image just wasn't seen as sort of being allowed really to do that kind of thing. So even in Clock Cleaners, Mickey is a little bit, he's trying to move this bird, but even when the bird almost like bites Mickey's head off, Mickey kind of like chuckles and is very amiable. Whereas like as soon as something bad happens to Donald, he reaches 11 and it kind of escalates in a.
I'm a little bit worried, Chris, that you're Mickey and I'm Donald.
Well, so this is where I'm always talking about Freud.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
No, as you were talking, I was thinking about. So Paul Wells in Understanding Animation has when he's talking about laughter and theories of character, he talks about different character types, and it made me think of it when you were saying, David, that there is the art of overreacting, that we can't. There are certain characters. What is it that marks out Mickey Mouse from Donald Duck? So Wells has this table: character type A, character type B, character type C. Controller, overreactor, nuisance. In other ways, the controller is the clown, the overreactor is the dupe or the killjoy, the nuisance is the counterfeit. And then he connects them to the id, superego, and ego, and then basically says that Bugs Bunny is the controller, the clown, the id, Elmer Fudd is the overreactor, the dupe or the killjoy, and the superego, and then Daffy Duck is the nuisance, the counterfeit, the ego. And so there was interesting, you sort of need, it makes perfect sense that they have this different, because then collectively together the audience sort of knows roughly what they're kind of getting, but it also allows for what Wells calls kind of that madcap tension between different kinds of characters. Though these roles predominate, they are not sometimes necessarily in flux to facilitate further gags, but their complexity runs deeper than merely structural device. So it's a sort of an ordering of different kinds of character, because one of my notes I had was around sort of personality, the rounding out of these personalities, that there's a real sort of that these are quite established stars by 1937. We're seeing them in colour. That there's a kind of classicism certainly to this film that I saw. And I put immediate hyper-realism. They are whistling while they work. There's a different use of musicality. They've got
shadows.
There's a kind of verisimilitude, depth, and that's playing out in terms of personality as much as environment. They are deep characters.
Yeah, well, yes, but actually, it's interesting. It plays out in terms of their bodies, their characterization, their physicality. But you made the Snow White gag. Like there's a certain similarity because there's also that sense of it is hyper real, but the world, not the characters, but the world is almost where that kind of, I don't know, bubbling sense of animation, of plasmaticness still survives, because there's bits like the clock will shout back in kind of clocky language to them, like when they smack a gear in the wrong way. I don't even quite know exactly what. There's that bit where like bang a thing and the noise it makes kind of like it's speaking back to them. The world has this kind of plasmatic charge to it in a way that like the woods of Snow White do, or but the characters themselves have to be shadowed and stay kind of in their individual lanes, which I just thought was striking. And then the other thing, you've mentioned Freud now, so you've got me all riled up. But but obviously, what the ego is, what psychoanalysts would say is the I function. So that's us, or at least that's what we think of as us, is the ego. So it makes sense that Mickey, despite not being that interesting, is functioning as the ego, because that's the thing that is. We can tolerate the other stuff in moments and in passing. We can tolerate Donald if we accept that he's not us, but Mickey's allowed to kind of Mickey we both judge him by our own standards and hold him up to a standard, because he's us, he's the I function. There we go.
No, I don't know. Yeah, I take the point that it's sort of doing different. I did notice a kind of split, I think, between the first two and the third one. That kind of shutting down of reflexivity, different use of kind of musicality, this rounding and rounding of personality, and I'm still interested in how bodies are charged with musicality, I think, but. I think there's definitely a kind of classicism to the landscape. And I like the idea that there's a kind of plasmatic potential latent in the world and available. But
because we're running out of time, I'm going to ask you one of the most impossible questions I think I've asked any guest so far, David, which is just to give us a little sketch where in very imperfect terms of, okay, this is Mickey in 1937. We're now in 2025. Like,
what does he do
what
next?
happens next? yeah, exactly. Are there some just like, is this would you say 1937 Mickey is our Mickey? Or is our Mickey very, very different in some ways, and it's worth just highlighting a couple of things to flag that up, obviously in very imperfect terms, because I've just asked you to cover nearly a century's worth of Mickey history in a couple of sentences, if you could.
Yeah. Well, he's getting there, I think, because you're saying that his sort of his function is necessary within the cartoons compared to the Donalds and the Goofies and so on. Unfortunately for Mickey, the studio increasingly felt that wasn't the case.
Oh, really? Okay, interesting.
Because although they kind of buoyed the Mickey cartoons with this formula of the trio narrative, very quickly there was this sort of feeling that these other characters were sort of too good to contain in a way. So Donald gets his own spin-off series around this time. Pluto, in fact, also gets one, and Goofy, I think, in 1939. So by the end of the decade, Mickey has kind of like lost his partners really on the screen, and they kind of cameo occasionally. I mean, again, with animation, it's not like if another star goes off to great fame, you can't get them back.
No,
you can, but
it's true. Such
really,
is true of animation, such is true as the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yeah.
Inconsequentiality.
But I think in some ways we can gloss over a fair amount of most of the 20th century, and that the Mickey series disappears during World War II mostly. There is a sort of brief attempt to, well, I say brief attempt, Mickey returns post-war, and there are a number of years of kind of much more sporadic Mickey Mouse cartoons, and they sort of increasingly they become sort of Pluto cartoons with Mickey just sort of there to be the figurehead, essentially. Mickey is actually one of the first of Disney's short cartoon series to be discontinued. Mickey's final big screen, Mickey's sort of final entry in the theatrical short cartoon series is in 1953 with a film, I believe, called The Simple Things. whereas like Donald and Goofy kind of carry on for a little bit longer. And yeah, it's really Mickey sort of then gets revitalized by television. The Mickey Mouse Club TV show sort of begins that process really of whereas kid audiences had enjoyed Mickey Mouse even in the 1930s. The Mickey Mouse Club is sort of the beginning of identifying children as a sort of discrete and marketable audience for animation and Mickey especially. And yeah, I mean, not much happens with him for quite a while really, apart from these kind of like figurehead appearances on television. I think you've covered Mickey's Christmas Carol in a previous episode, and that was kind of his sort of big screen comeback of sorts. But even there, we've seen more limited appearances from him on the big screen. It's really in the last few decades there's been a lot more sort of evocations of him on television.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, without really having the time to sort of pick it apart, what has been quite interesting with some of the modern versions of Mickey, even though there are things like Mickey Mouse Clubhouse and various kind of takes on that, which are like Mickey Mouse for preschoolers, there has been a sort of greater tendency in recent years to kind of try and recapture at least something of the more mischievous Mickey that was found in the early years. I suppose, like most visibly, the cartoon Get a Horse that preceded the cartoon Get a Horse that preceded Frozen. Actually kind of does some of those slightly sort of rude gags. Cow's udders are sort of fairly unambiguously presented in sort of suggestive ways, and Mickey loses his...
They're Randy again.
Exactly. Mickey loses his shorts at some point.
Oh,
and everything.
Classic.
So yeah, there seems to be a kind of greater willingness to actually explore the Mickey that was once shied away from in Disney. In the Disney kind of mythologizing of the character. But obviously that sits alongside, there are almost kind of like multiple Mickeys in a sense. And that's kind of where I end my book, actually, is sort of talking about the possibility. And obviously in the case of like Woody and Buzz, as we started with, a sort of multiplicity of roles could very quickly overwhelm what we perceive to be their star value. Whereas, with Mickey, there was always that built in, but, as we get to a point where Mickey is approaching his 100th birthday and, we don't really have a lot of models really for dealing with a star that's 100 years old, because mortality usually sort of ends that.
Well, Dick Van Dyke's 99, so we've got.
Well,
I had a question about the kind of medium of all of this, because you mentioned Get a Horse. And Once Upon a Studio, so the more recent sort of celebration of Disney. But Get a Horse in particular, the short that uses... Well, both of them use sort of original audio footage and kind of cobble it together. But obviously in Get a Horse, you have the cell or hand-drawn Mickey coexisting with a computer-generated model. Yeah. And then you talked about earlier, Alex, when you sort of got Sweaty Palms meeting...
Mickey Mouse.
Mm-hmm. But theme parks are slightly different because you that's not... Well, I don't know. My sense is that's not the Mickey Mouse. That is a facsimile of Mickey Mouse.
Well, yes, but in the same... Yes, but yeah, I mean, let's not... We haven't got time to...
No.
Yes, I know what you mean. Yes.
So I suppose the multiplicity of Mickeys, we're also talking about... We now have digital Mickeys. We have digitized Mickeys. We have pristine 3D computer-generated models of Mickey. And so... But that's still the same Mickey as... Like the version in colour that you see is still the black and white. The three-dimensional computer-animated version is still the cell one. So it's sort of his stardom traverses sort of ontology as much as anything else.
Yeah, I think the Disney studio has still been keen to sort of perpetuate a narrative in which Mickey is an actor for whom all of these contradictions, just like Dyer's concept of stardom, the actor's body, contains all of this... this irreconcilable stuff, as you say. Like, why is Mickey three-dimensional suddenly and not black and white anymore?
Just don't ask. Just don't ask.
So, I think that is probably where I would sort of perceive the star image. If Mickey Mouse's star image ever kind of breaks, it's probably when they stop kind of presenting that kind of like actor filmography reading that sort of supersedes all of that stuff we were talking about earlier about like what are the boundaries between character and narrative, and who is Mickey Mouse in one cartoon relative to another. For Dyer's concept of live action stardom, and I think really the way Mickey has been evoked by the studios, it is all of that doesn't matter because Mickey Mouse the actor is playing these different roles. And none of these this era of cartoon characters has perhaps been so explicitly, I mean, even this is a sort of difficult term to unpack, but like rebooted. They haven't sort of aimed to start again from year one with Mickey Mouse in the way that, maybe they will with Toy Story at some point. That, sort of, I suppose, breathing life into that property at some point in the future might involve starting again, whereas Mickey's star image is one that is much more, because it's not kind of contained to a particular franchise with its own narrative world. Mickey's stardom is one that seemingly can go from being in a kids educational or edutainment series in one moment to being back on the big screen ahead of Frozen or something. Yeah.
Well, I think on that note we should end our journey with Mickey Mouse for today. But it's been really interesting unpacking it. This is obviously based largely on your book, Animated Sun, that Chris read out at the beginning. We'll put a link. People can find it. Like Mickey, you've done so much since then, though. So what projects have we got coming up in the near future, or that have just come out?
Yeah. Do you have a busy summer by any chance? Doing anything in the summer?
Either right now, listening to it when it just comes out, or in a few years' time, could access and enjoy.
Yeah, definitely. If people are listening to this shortly after it's broadcast.
Yes.
So you'll be listening to this in roughly late April, May, listeners. Hello to you all in the future.
So I'm organising with my institution, London College of Communication, which is part of University of the Arts London. We are organising the 36th Annual Society for Animation Studies Conference. If anyone disagrees with my theories about Mickey Mouse,
hunt him down and find him.
Yeah, there are 4 days, 7th to the 10th of July in 2025, where you can come and tell me exactly all of the ways I'm wrong about Mickey Mouse. Well, and I suppose I would also just do a plug for, I'm quite excited that I have an article coming out in Screen, which is quite a big thing, dealing with one of those I forgot what the term I used earlier. Dealing with one of those human cartoons who call themselves stars in Hollywood. I'm talking about the franchise era and talking about Sylvester Stallone and Rocky, the spectre of Rocky IV, which I'm quite pleased to have got into to talk about Rocky IV in the hallowed pages of Screen.
Yeah. Well, it might surprise you to know I've seen none of the Rockies, so this is...
does actually surprise me. That does surprise me. That seems like the sort of thing you would have seen.
So I've got the box set, so I'll do some prep ahead of that. So, and then anything animation tinged?
No, I'm doing it. I've been trying to sort of do a lot of stardom stuff at the moment, actually.
I just cannot believe you're overlooking the book that we're editing.
Of course,
once again, I threw you a ball.
Yes, Chris and I are co-editing Volume 4 of this multi-volume project, which is very exciting and very memorable.
Clearly.
Just like Mickey.
Yeah, the Encyclopedia of Animation Studies, which is coming from Bloomsbury in...
the future.
In the future, yes. But that's bringing together so many amazing animation studies scholars. I'm sure many names that are previous guests of the podcast,
Absolutely.
And I'm sure it will throw up some guests of the future.
Yeah.
Don't worry, David. I co-edited a book with him once, and I barely remember what it was called.
I feel like you've done that joke. I feel like you've done that joke as well.
Probably.
Yeah.
100 and how many episodes have we done of this now? The
still
jokes
hurts.
keep repeating
Still
themselves.
hurts.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm looking forward to that project. So that probably won't be out when this episode's out, but listeners in the future will be able to access it. SAS is at Society of Animation Studies will be this summer. Chris and I will be there, probably podcasting away. Do come along. Otherwise,
if you disagree with David and want it on,
the podcast,
and want us to record it,
what a service we could provide.
Recording a right to reply.
Yeah. Otherwise, David, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
You can find us at fantasy-animation.org, and you can find us on social media at FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research. You can also use that same handle, FANANIM Research, at gmail.com to email us any feedback or suggestions for footnote episodes in the future. Otherwise, that's been us for an episode. We'll see you next time.
Bye.